About a year ago, I started following a social media account of a married couple in Portland, Oregon. Their names are David and Katie Wolford, and they post about their house. Specifically, the kind of stuff their videos are about is about the major home renovation project they're doing on their home. Now, maybe you're like me. I like a good home renovation show. I bet I'm not alone in that. And here, I bet there are some of you, I won't make you out yourself, but are like a fixer-upper fan, have made the trek to Magnolia. I too have been there and feasted upon the food trucks of the green. But the thing about David and Katie's project that was different from those kind of HGTV, DIY home renovation things is that their videos really showed how just abjectly terrible their house was. And I don't mean that in the sense that, like, boy, was it dated and needed some, facelift. No, I mean to say that they had bought this home, which is this 1940s home, from a family that had lived there their whole life, but had developed this hoarding problem while living there. And so one of the things the video showcased is just how this house was packed with just junk. I mean, we've all seen hoarder stuff like that, right? And it's just like every room is just full of things that is just, there's no way to describe it other than trash and refuse, just awful. And they've cut holes in the wall so they could keep just shoving stuff in. It was so bad. But it wasn't just the hoarding, all right? It was also the neglect. Both the inside and the outside suffered from mold and rot, and there's just grease and dirt on everything, and the yard is so overgrown it looks like it's being swallowed up by nature. And apparently I just was so thankful that in 2024 we have not figured out how to embed smell into videos, right? Just every video they're just talking about how bad it smells, and like, oh, let's show you this room. Oh, it's awful. It smells so bad in here. And I'm watching these videos and I'm like, this seems like a nightmare, okay? It's like the people who owned this home before them had just completely forgotten what a house was supposed to be. They got it confused with a dump or a landfill or something. It had become this grotesque thing that it shouldn't be. But what I saw wasn't the same thing that David and Katie saw. In fact, the new homeowners of this home, they saw this beautiful 1940s home that they wanted to spend the rest of their lives in. I didn't want to spend like 10 seconds in that house, but they wanted to spend the rest of their lives in. And so they had moved heaven and earth to buy the home, and now they were trying to move heaven and earth again to transform it back into the thing it was supposed to be. In our gospel reading this morning, as I was reading it this week, it made me think of that project, of that home renovation story I just told you, because it too features some people who have lost sight of what a thing is supposed to be. In this instance, in our gospel reading in Mark, the thing that they have lost sight of is the law generally, but specifically the Sabbath. Now, this is not a sermon about the Sabbath or the law outright. I'm going to say that up front, but it is so central to the conflict of our gospel that I just want to touch on that issue of what the Sabbath was. You can see that the law and by extension the Sabbath is there in our Deuteronomy reading. This is the part where Moses in the Old Testament is reminding the Israelites before they take the promised land. He's reminding them what the 10 commandments were. And so we get here again the commandment to keep the Sabbath, to remember the Sabbath and to keep it holy. And on that day, of course, the Sabbath, in case you've not been to church and missed Sabbath day or whatever, and it's just like in one ear out the other, the Sabbath was this day of rest where nobody was supposed to work, right? Like you weren't supposed to work, your spouse wasn't supposed to work, the kids aren't supposed to work, the slaves aren't supposed to work, the animals aren't supposed to work, even the foreigners living there, can't make them work either. Everybody was supposed to rest, right? And so the reason for that God had commanded this is that it served as a testament to the kind of life that they had been brought out of, namely that they were slaves. You know the thing about being a slave? A lot of people don't talk about this, but when you're a slave, you don't get to choose when you work or not. right? That's a key feature of slavery. You work when people tell you to work. You don't get to rest if you aren't told you can. And so this thing that God had commanded them was supposed to remember that they had come out of that slavery and now could rest. In fact, we see that the Sabbath is really kind of like a sacrament of rest, of calling people to regularly return to rest and a God who cares about their needs. This is the idea. This is the thing that is supposed to happen. But of course, like, people are people. For hundreds of thousands of years, we're all people. So the Sabbath rolls around, and people start asking, like, what is it? What really constitutes work, right? Like, what's really rest? And so they started to try to figure this out. And when it came to the Israelites, they really took like a maximalist approach. They basically said, look, most things constitute work if you do too much of it, right? I mean, that's a simple solution. But they even did things like count out the number of steps you could take and things like that. So you could kind of get a framework for what is and isn't work. Now, jumping back to our gospel, Jesus and the Pharisees, they're having themselves a conflict over the Sabbath. And honestly, Jesus and the Pharisees are pretty much always having a conflict, right? Like, that's just a narrative of the New Testament. In this instance, they are bumping heads about the Sabbath. Right before this, they were bumping heads about fasting, but now they're on to the Sabbath. Pharisees always got something. And the thing that they're upset is that Jesus' disciples are collecting food, they're collecting grain and eating it on the Sabbath. Now, that's not theft. That's a thing in Israel that you were supposed to do. You're supposed to leave part of your field so that people who were poor or hungry could come by and take some food for themselves. But the deal about food preparation was you didn't do that on the Sabbath. That's work. Okay? The Pharisees' big argument here is like, look, your disciples should have collected this food yesterday. Okay? They shouldn't be doing this today. Today's the Sabbath. They should be resting today. That's work. Now, mind you, the Old Testament punishment for breaking the Sabbath, as prescribed, is death. They were serious about rest, okay? Next time your spouse is like, hey, I need you to mow the lawn on Sunday, you just bring this back up, okay? It works for dishes too. Anyway, so, yeah, the penalty was death. And the thing about the Pharisees is they are exactly the kind of like follow the letter of the law people who think that there should be a overly severe punishment for failure, right? That's exactly who they are. But Jesus, I don't know if you've met him, he's a sharp guy. He's quick. And so they bring this issue to him, and Jesus throws them a deep cut from King David's life. This story, it's found in 1 Samuel chapter 21, if you want to go home and nerd out. It's the story where David is on this mission, and he has these soldiers, and they're hungry, and so he goes by the temple, and he's like, hey, we need food. And the priest is like, well, I've only got this consecrated holy bread. And as the story goes, he's like, well, we need food, and the priest is like, well, are your men, are you clean? Are you ritually clean? Are your men clean? And they're like, yes. And they're like, all right. And he gives them the bread to eat. And Jesus is using this as an illustration to say, like, look, that bread wasn't created, it was created to, like, bread was created so that man can eat. It wasn't because God needs bread, right? And in the same way, the Sabbath, there wasn't a day of rest, and so God created people so they could rest on it. There were people, and they needed rest. And so God created the sacrament of the Sabbath so they could rest. Like, that's the heart of the thing. Jesus is trying to say, you've got really this thing backwards here. You got to remember that, like, that's what he's saying. The man wasn't created for the Sabbath. The Sabbath was created for the man. He's like, you got to remember, this is on your head. It's not just the letter of the law, it's the heart of the law. Now, the point of the law, right, of which the Sabbath was a part of, this is the thing that the Pharisees had forgotten. The point of the law was to point people to God. But the Pharisees, and the way that they have gone about this, they are making the law itself just the point. And so Jesus says, hey, you've got this thing backwards. And And after this exchange, I don't know what the Pharisees' response is. It's probably to leave. That's their MO. We see that on the same day, Jesus goes out to a synagogue. Now, Jesus and his disciples, they enter a synagogue in the same town they're in, same day, and who should be there but some Pharisees? Also, a man with a withered hand. And it is in this scenario that we get to see the Pharisees really betray the fact that they care more about the letter of the law than the heart of the law. Because what it says they're doing in this environment is they're watching Jesus. Let's pull out our bulletin. Let's just read it. Look, it's one more time. This is in verse, verse 2. They watched him to see whether he would cure him on the Sabbath. He, being Jesus, would cure the man with the withered hand on the Sabbath, so they might accuse him. This man with a withered hand, he is not a man to the Pharisees. He is a honeypot, right? He's there to catch Jesus so that they might accuse him of breaking the Sabbath. And of course, as I've told you earlier, the penalty for that is death. But again, Jesus, he's a quick guy. He reads the situation. So he tries to engage the Pharisees again. But this time, they're not having any of it. They just stay silent, it says. They're just waiting and they see. They've apparently watched this Jesus guy. They know that he cannot resist a situation to heal someone when they're in close proximity. And Jesus, recognizing in them the hardness of heart, it says he is angered and grieved. When it comes to the Pharisees, like I said, the situation here, the conflict is about the law and the Sabbath. For them, there was just one way to get to God, and that was doing the things you were supposed to do, checking the action boxes. That was it. It didn't matter how you felt about it. It didn't matter what was going on inside. You did the things the law prescribed. In fact, it did not matter to them that there was this guy, Jesus, who was just right there in front of them. He was teaching with authority. He was performing miracles. He was healing people. Jesus, whatever the thing it was he was offering, whatever he represented, it did not fit into the system. Okay? He was inscrutable to them. It did not fit into the structure, the system that they had. A system, mind you, that needed a man to go unhealed for it to keep working. And Jesus was pained by that. He grieved that this is who they were. The Pharisees, they had forgotten what the law was for. They had forgotten what the covenant was about. Their whole relationship with God, how to get to God, it had become this awful, grotesque, disfigured thing. They had become hoarders of doing what was right, of pious action. But instead of these actions drawing them closer to God, all they did was self-serving, improving their own image in their own eyes and in the eyes of others. And so Jesus grieved. Our gospel then tells us, we read that Jesus calls him forward in verse 3. And in verse 5, he says to the man, "Stretch out your hand." And the man stretched it out. And I think this is kind of this beautiful part of the story, that as the man reached out to Jesus, as he reached out to God, his hand is healed. It is restored. It is made the thing it was supposed to be again. We have a song happening in here. This story, this story about the grains and the withered hand, it's not found just here in Mark. I want to point out, this is actually found in all three of the synoptic gospels. It's found in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And the thing about stories like that is that it becomes like, it tells us that this is maybe an essential story to understanding the gospel of Jesus Christ. And one of the messages this story tells us is this: God wants to transform your life. He wants to transform you and make you as you were meant to be. And the way that this happens is by giving over the broken parts of your life to him. We have a God who cares about our needs, as evidenced through the Sabbath, but not just through the Sabbath, but also as evidenced through the reconciliation, through the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. God saw us in our slavery to sin and made a way for us to be free. But to get that freedom, to be transformed, you have to be able to recognize when and where in your life things are broken. No Israelites who refused to leave Egypt were freed from slavery. No people who refuse to acknowledge the brokenness in themselves can be transformed. This was the problem for the Pharisees. The things in their life that they needed to stretch out to Jesus was their heart. But they couldn't recognize this, or they couldn't respond to this. They were like people who allowed the home around them to become some kind of grotesque mockery of itself. The Pharisees watched a miracle in front of them of a man's hand being healed, and they left the building to go plot for Jesus' destruction. With the Herodians, no less, who are they're not cool with, right? Like, they were not friends. This is the enemy of my enemy is my friend type situation. Friends, we must examine our lives and our families and our church to see the places where Jesus is standing, beckoning us to reach out to him. To reach out with our time or our eyes or our anger, to reach out with what distracts us or wearies us or scares us. We have to recognize and confront the places where we have, metaphorically, have a withered hand and have to choose not to try to shove it into our pocket and pretend like everything's okay. We have to trust that Jesus will heal all the places that we reach out to him. Look, the goal of God's plan is not to free a house from the bondage of hoarders and neglectors and then just let it succumb to the injuries of its past, okay? And it's not God's plan to just clean up like the outside of the house, but let the inside stay a putrid mess. And it is furthermore not God's plan just to clean up like half the rooms in the house so that, the entryway and the living room look really nice, but if you go into the guest bath, there's like a broken toilet and like moldy wallpaper. Okay? God's plan of salvation for the world, which includes you, which includes me, has been and always will be to reconcile all things to himself and transform them into what they were meant to be. To reconcile you to himself and transform you into the person you were meant to be. And true, this may not happen for all of us in this life, probably for most of us. It may not be truly accomplished until we are birthed from this life through death into the next life and made perfect then. But I will tell you, on this side of things, God's plan through Jesus Christ and the sanctifying work of the Holy Spirit is to go fix as many rooms as possible, room by room, if we will keep reaching towards Jesus. If every time we turn around and find a new door and open it up, we extend that out to Jesus too. It is his plan to keep working on all the rooms. If we will only not hold back the broken parts of us. If we will only not be silent when Jesus speaks. If we won't leave the building when he's trying to engage us, God will take the broken parts of our lives and transform us. Transform this church. Transform the whole world into what it was meant to be. Amen.